It's about time we had genuine free trade within Canada.
In the face of Donald Trump's tariff threat,
we're going to put the biggest tariffs. I think tariffs are the most beautiful word.
Canadian leaders have been talking a lot about something you may not have considered before.
We can do quicker and faster trade with 51 other countries in the world, including the US. It's ridiculous.
Tearing down internal trade barriers, finding out what can we buy from each other. Those are a couple of the conversations that we need to have.
So what is an interprovincial trade barrier? How did we get here, and what can be done now?
I've never seen the whole country so united about one issue, short of hockey. Are we 13 provincial fiefdoms, or are we one economic union?
So let's get into it. Interprovincial trade barriers vary across the country, but essentially they're regulations and restrictions that can block the free movement of some goods and labor from going back and forth between all the provinces and territories. And that's costing Canada a lot of money and productivity. The Canadian Federation of Independent Business says that getting rid of these internal trade barriers could boost Canada's GDP by up to $200 billion annually.
There's just layer after layer after layer of these types of things that just bog businesses down and add costs to doing business in Canada.
Consider the sale of alcohol. Run a craft brewery in Gatineau and want to sell your beer to a nearby Ottawa restaurant? You're out of luck. Have a winery in Nova Scotia? Well, you can only sell and ship directly to customers in just a few provinces. Even though in most places across the country, you can get alcohol from all over the world.
Ontarians are now waking up to the fact that they might not want their California wine, but they would love to tap into a way broader British Columbia wine set.
Ryan Minucha wrote a book on interprovincial trade. If anything is ever going to change for Canadians, he says, this is the moment.
They're tired of hearing the platitudes and the rhetoric. They're saying, what are the actual policy differences we can make?
And experts like Ryan say a big area to look at are the inconsistent regulations and technical requirements that get in the way of doing business all across the country. One big example is the trucking industry, with the provinces having different requirements for things like weight or tire size.
You may have to stop at the border of each province and make slight adjustments to your truck because there's different weights versus wheelbases and that kind of thing.
With trucking, we're seeing the clash in rules and regulations creating $1.6 billion in cost a year. If we can come out with a mutual recognition agreement on trucking, it would show that this is a viable tool to use on other issues.
Another issue, professional licensing differences, making it hard for some workers' certifications to carry over to other provinces. Anita Anand, the Minister of Internal Trade, is vowing change, even claiming Canada's many trade barriers can be wiped out in just 30 days.
So you're going to see these barriers coming down.
But if that's possible now, then a big question is why have all these barriers existed for so long, especially when leaders and businesses over the decades have loudly complained about their impact?
Why can't a Montrealer buy a bottle of beer brewed in the Maritimes when that same beer is a bestseller in Washington, D.C.?
The answer is complicated. At the time of Confederation in 1867, free trade was actually written into Canada's Constitution Act. It says all growth, produce, or manufacture of any one of the provinces shall be admitted free into each of the other provinces.
The Fathers of Confederation had just seen the cancellation of an early US-Canada free trade agreement in 1866. When that north-south linkage comes into question, we start to rethink east-west.
But as the country grew, barriers to free trade across the provinces started popping up anyway. And in 1921, the Supreme Court ruled that free trade meant free from tariffs, not free from regulation.
Our Constitution gives a good deal of regulatory authority to the provinces and territories, and that's so important to keep the second largest country by landmass together, right? But that same power also provides for fiefdoms erected through the course of regulation. It's using those tools to protect your local interests.
In 2017, another court case and another verdict impeding free trade, the so-called Free the Beer case.
How does it feel to be the center of a constitutional challenge?
Oh, kind of feels good.
That's Gerard Comeau. He was fined for bringing beer from Quebec back home to New Brunswick. He had 14 cases and a few bottles of liquor, more than provincial limits allow. His lawyers argued the fine violated the free trade clause. But the Supreme Court ruled unanimously that provinces have the right to restrict goods coming in, so long as the restriction is not specifically about limiting trade.
At the end of the day, it was to protect probably local revenues, right? That selling beer out of alcohol NB brings a great deal of money to the province. And that money is used to pay for schools, used to pay for the healthcare system, right? The Supreme Court sort of a little fearful because they didn't want to upset the social fabric and our common understanding. If the Supreme Court came out and said, yes, Canada has absolute free trade.
But around the same time, there was a push to open things up with the signing of the Canadian Free Trade Agreement. The agreement was a step forward, creating a formal process to make internal trade easier. But provinces and territories pushed for dozens of exemptions, and trade barriers carried on.
You know, these regulations and laws can be rewritten. It would be at late nights for a bunch of lawyers. The literal act of doing it is not that difficult. It also takes that political will, which is the key ingredient.
If they became our 51st state, it would be the greatest thing they could ever do.
That political will seems to be there now, with Trump threatening a seismic trade war. But talking about it is one thing. Actually getting rid of those barriers is another. Provinces, territories, and hundreds of regulatory bodies across the country would all have to get on the same page, and some may not be happy.
When you unlock protections for a domestic constituency, it can hurt some stakeholders, but at the end of the day, you have to ask, what are we trying to achieve here?
What is a practical first step when there's so much to it?
First thing is a mutual recognition agreement on trucking. And getting that across the line is so vital. And
he says those credential conflicts need to go.
It's about making labor more mobile. A lot of other downstream problems that we face, the housing crisis, for example, would be helped if people could cross with their credentials way more easily than they can now.
What if on March 1st, Trump says, okay, now I'm happy with the border now, you've done enough. Do you really have faith at that point that political will remains, or is it really just tied to this threat from Donald Trump?
As soon as we start talking about electrical codes, it gets a little nitty-gritty, but if we can stay at the high level and have a goal that the whole country is rallying around, that's what we should be striving for. And we have to capitalize on how far we can push the puck while the spotlight is on the file.